So far, we've seen how Flowgorithm can be helpful to us in testing our logic and learning the logic structuring portion of what we need to train our mind to do as we learn to program. But more than that, Flowgorithm can actually help us learn a little bit about the Visual Basic language, where its limitations end is that Flowgorithm is not going to help us to program the GUI. It's not going to generate code for a graphical user interface only for plain text console work, but I think you'll find that even so, sometimes the tricky part is not the user interface and the graphical elements. The tricky part is often understanding exactly what we have to do and what order in order to structure our algorithm, our logic of our computer program to do the right thing. So here we have Flowgorithm up again with our hello world, and as we saw, we can run that and not a terribly complex program. Um, it just runs and outputs hello world. But what would that look like in Visual Basic, for example? And so one of the things we can do is we can come to a Flowgorithm and ask it to tell us in the tools, what does the source code look like? And when you first open it, it'll default to Java, which is interesting, and I encourage you to explore this. You can see what this code would look like in a number of different programs. And again, kind of limited and without the GUI, but you can see your logic in all these different languages, including visualbasic.net. But I'm going to ask you to do something a little bit different. Rather than taking the generic visualbasic.net, I want you to open a custom template of visualbasic.net that I have modified specifically to help you in this class. And so let's open that template and we will get the source code generated in visualbasic.net with a couple of twists from Professor Beck that will help things be a little bit more clear, I hope. So let's open up. I have over in on my computer where I've stored my CIS 119 resources is under Documents, CIS 119, and there's a folder called Source Code Templates, and it may vary if you're running locally and have configured your computer. If you've downloaded your files differently, you would look wherever you'd put them. And under VB.net, and here's the generic template. But here's the one I want, VBNet CIS 119, made just for this class. And I'm going to open that. And so here is our source code generated by Flowgorithm for VB.net. And so it has the entire module, and it's named the module 1 by default. This is one of the things that is named differently if you use the default VB.net template. So I prefer you use mine because you won't have to correct that. I think the default calls it my program, but module 1 is what the current version of Visual Studio is defaulting to. And the other thing that I've done is I have added a line to the template that since we're generating a console windows close automatically when the program has finished running. And so I've added an extra console.read key, get an input after the end, which will hold that window open long enough for you to see the results. Otherwise, it's very frustrating. You ran the program and blip, the window disappears and you don't get to see, did that result work or what did it do? It can be a little bit confusing. So I've made that modification to the template. So let's see how we can use this together with Visual Studio and with the Visual Basic language in order to learn using the Flowgorithm tools. So this tool here will copy all of this code to the clipboard. So I'm going to click on that. And now it's been copied to the clipboard. And now I'm going to change over to Visual Studio. And let's create a new console project in VB. File, New, Project. Here's all the different kinds of projects I can build. Remember, if you've defaulted to something different, if it's showing you C++ or C#, or something else, remember to come down to Visual Basic. And in Visual Basic, I want to create a console app for the .NET framework. Name it if you want to name it something different. If you want to change the location, you can change the path to your project here and tell it OK. The project is created, and it's created an empty Module 1 for me. But I have on the clipboard my completed Module 1 from Flowgorithm. So I'm going to highlight everything here, and I'm going to press Control V, or you could say Edit Paste. And there's my code that was generated for me by Flowgorithm. And so now I can study this code to try and understand how it works. And so what I've created in the flowcharting tool and tested in Flowgorithm, I've now translated to Visual Basic. Now again, this isn't coding up for text boxes and buttons and things. This is a plain Jane console window, but a lot of the hard part of what we're trying to learn here is going to be in the core logic that doesn't really have to do with the user interface. And so it can still be very, very useful to get a start. And once you start to understand more about the language itself, you can even take the core code that you create here and move it into a GUI, and you would add or make the changes here. And so instead of the console write line to text that we might modify the text property of the text box, for example. But let's see what happens when we try and run this. Okay, so it is done a console output of hello world, and now it's waiting to read a key. It's waiting for input, which has held this window open for us. As I said, it would otherwise disobligingly close automatically. And so I'll hit enter, and bam, the program has finished running. Let's take a look. We can actually modify this code so that you could see what would happen if that extra input line, that extra console.read key hadn't been added. One of the things we can do is by putting a single quote at the beginning. Notice that the text all turned green. And again, this color coding is something else that the programmer's editor built into our um, uh, programmer's toolkit, which is to say Visual Studio, is doing for us is different colors mean different things. So keywords are in black, structures are in blue, comments are in green, and comments are there for human beings to read to help clarify what the code is doing, or something we need to remind ourselves of, or any other programmer that might start modifying this when we're long gone and have moved on to new jobs or writing new code. Somebody's going to be maintaining our code. The comments can help to clarify exactly what is going on. As a matter of fact, before I made this a comment, you can see there's a comment following this read key command that tells us this line was auto-generated by Flowgorithm to hold the console open until you press a key. I added that comment to the Flowgorithm template that we use to generate the source code, so it would be that comment would be generated here for everybody. And we're going to go ahead and comment this out. So by changing it to a comment, the command is still there, but it's now being interpreted as an instruction or for information just for human beings, not an instruction the computer should run. And now you'll see if we don't hold it open, watch quickly, when we run it, start, the window opens, it ran it closed. Did you see that? Yeah, I couldn't read it that fast either. So that's why we throw the extra input in there to hold the window open. So now that it's asking for the input, let's run it. So here it did the hello world output, and here it's waiting for the next input. That's actually where it's running that read key. And instead of hitting the enter key this time, let's hit the J key. Okay, it doesn't matter. Any key will, once it's read, will move forward. So there we have it. This is how then we can use the Flowgorithm tool to create code that we can use to run in our Visual Basic project. And so this is going to be useful as primarily a learning tool to help us master our VB. So as we start writing more complex code, so when we start declaring variables and then making decisions and adding loops and doing other things, we'll be able to generate that code. You'll be able to test it here in Flowgorithm, but then if you want to see it as generated in the Visual Basic language, you can use the tool's source code viewer and go see it in VB, and you can even export it to working VB code for the console environment.